Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today for this important conversation about the power of science, evidence, and information literacy to counter misinformation and its adverse effects. I'm Joshua Walker, President and CEO of Japan Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our landmark building just across the street from the United Nations, where there's a few things going on this week, but we're celebrating our 50th anniversary here, and we're very excited. As some of you may know, Japan Society is a premier organization connecting Japan and the U.S. through arts, culture, business, and society with audiences here in New York and around the world. We're honored to be hosting today's timely and critical roundtable discussion about the threats posed by misinformation in a digital world and how science can be an effective antidote. I'd particularly like to highlight and commend the efforts of the CollaborateUp, which recently published this report, News Literacy and Misinformation/Disinformation in the Era of COVID-19. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussions about that title, what it means. We know that information spreads at an increasingly fast rate thanks to new technologies and platforms, but it also means that false information travels just as and sometimes even more quickly. One of the stats that struck me particularly from the report was that false stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. As we continue to grapple with the effects of this global pandemic, it's clear that now more than ever, we need to fight the spread of misinformation. And I'm eager to learn from our esteemed panelists and experts today who are here. And it is weird to be talking to you in the virtual space, but you in the physical space. It's so great to be in person. I hope we can capture that synergy and energy together today. But without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to the maestro of the afternoon, Richard Crispin, CEO of CollaborateUp, who will share some of the key trends from the report. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you all here in the room, and thank you everyone for dialing in from around the world. We're so grateful to be here, as Joshua said, at the Japan Society, live coming to you this week of UN General Assembly, just steps from where the UN General Assembly is meeting as we speak. And as Richard Crispin, CEO and moderator for today's discussion, it's my real and true pleasure to welcome all of you into this room and into this conversation. As Joshua mentioned, we are releasing a report today on news literacy and disinformation in the era of COVID-19. And we're so grateful to our sponsors, Philip Morris International, who have helped to underwrite our efforts here for the research as well as for today's conversation. So thank you to them. And today we're going to get into many of the different types of the implications of this research. And what I want to do really quickly is just give you a bit of a roadmap for our conversation. I'm going to start off by presenting the 5 trends that are in the report. And then we're going to have a conversation with our panelists here in the room. And then I'll present the 5 recommendations also in the report and have a conversation with our panelists here in the room. We are particularly focused on the dilemma that disinformation poses to collective action and to collaboration. Because at CollaborateUp, that is our mission, to accelerate collaboration among companies, nonprofits, and governments when they take on some of our world's toughest challenges. So what I want to do is quickly take you through some of the report's trends. In order to put together today's research, what we did is we delved into an extensive literature review, reading over 40 different sources of information, research reports, studies, articles, news articles and information, and many different books on this topic. We then held consultative roundtables around the world in the United States, in Latin America, in Japan, Southeast Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the United Kingdom and the European Union. And we've assembled all of that information gathered from over 100 experts who are actually working on these topics around the world, on the ground in these different countries, and we assembled them into this report. And we identified 5 clear trends. The first trend is that evolving technologies are driving an evolving definition of misinformation and disinformation, leading to a declining trust in experts and institutions. And if I can unpack that for just a minute, I would tell you that there is a distinction that we make in the report between misinformation, a lie, and disinformation, a lie deliberately spread. And what we're also seeing is that because of digital media and the advent of all these new technologies, public policy and science are increasingly being done live on television in front of our eyes. So what we previously thought of as fixed, concrete ideas or topics have now become malleable and fluid. And that is helping to undermine our sense of confidence in ourselves and our decisions and the decisions of our leaders and key institutions. The second major trend is that the acceleration of digital technologies has increased the speed at which lies spread. Lies are nothing new. Propaganda is nothing new. It's probably been with us since at least the 17th century. But what is new and different is the scale and speed at which the technology has enabled the spread of that disinformation and misinformation. The third major trend is that the digital world has erased standards we're used to in the physical world. So it used to be that the definition, as given to us by the Supreme Court, on the limitation of free speech was yelling fire in a crowded theater. But all of the things in that sentence were physically verifiable. Was I in a crowded theater? Did I yell? Was it on fire? I could go touch and verify whether or not any of those things happened. But with public policy and science now happening live on television, but away from me, in non-physically verifiable forums and ways, these concrete things that have now become fluid have become much less easily verifiable. And we need new approaches for dealing with a digital world when we have legal and regulatory frameworks that are really built for a physical world. Which brings me to the fourth trend, and that is that tech-enabled scale and speed make regulating the flow of information increasingly challenging. Our legal and regulatory frameworks were formed over centuries for a very analog world, and now we need new models to deal with the fast spread of technology. But good laws are not often fast laws. So how we are going to go ahead and deal with and put in place new approaches for dealing with these digital trends will be something we'll have to really get into on today's panel. And the last trend that I want to point out is that we have a continuing inability to address psychology, fundamental human psychology in these tech platforms and regulatory models. The tech platforms and the business models that they are built on are meant to be sticky. And sticky is good if we're trying to get people to stay on the platform. Sticky is bad if it becomes addictive. The tech platforms were also designed to help influence our behavior, to help us perhaps make better decisions when it comes to buying a new car. That, taken to extreme, can become manipulation and can play to our worst possible instincts. So that's what we're going to get into. We're going to talk about all of these different trends, and now it's my real pleasure to bring into our conversation all of the folks that we have here in the room. So let me introduce them to you briefly. We're so grateful. Mariela Machado, you have worked across the academic, private, and public sectors in a career that has included work for telecommunications companies and nonprofits in the ICT for development and tech for development sectors, including your current role as program manager at Engineering for Change, a nonprofit working on projects all over the world. Welcome, Mariela.
Thank you so much.
Paul Mickoff, who is coming to us virtually. Paul, thank you so much for being with us. You serve as Senior Vice President for Global Partnerships at the New York Academy of Sciences, where you focus on nutrition and health, and you are also an adjunct professor of political science at Fordham University and Kettering College in Ohio. You've also held multiple roles across the public sector and civil society, responsible for many multi-billion-dollar humanitarian programs. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Jennifer Oldfield, you are the Director of External Relations at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, where you work to harness and leverage data and data technology towards achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a mission that really resonates with me. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And Diana, you oversee partnerships in gender and technology for UN Women, where you work to ensure no woman or girl is left behind, focusing on capacity building for the 21st century job market, and specifically focus on UN Women's partnership with Equals Global Partnership and the Broadband Commission. Welcome so much.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And Gregoire Berthaud, you are the Senior Vice President for External Affairs at Philip Morris International, where you've capstoned an extensive career in consumer and public affairs, including time as European Policy Director at Électricité de France, serving as the Deputy Head of Cabinet for the President of France, and several positions at the United Nations, the European Commission, and the French Foreign Ministry. Welcome, Gregoire.
Thank you.
And finally, and certainly not leastly, Kai Young, you founded Social Impact Partners after 15 years of experience working in resource mobilization capacities at nonprofits and within the United Nations system, including serving as the Director of Corporate Relations for the UN Foundation, the world's largest organization dedicated to advocacy and support for UN careers. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Richard. Happy to be here.
Let's really dive into this conversation here. And I want to reflect on our trends, and Paul, if I could turn to you first, we'd love to hear what trends you're seeing in the role of mainstream media in misinformation and disinformation what is the importance of the nexus between traditional media, new digital media, and misinformation, disinformation, especially related to science?
Yeah, Richard, thanks so much. Delighted to be here. I think the question is very important and very pertinent because we cannot actually place all of the blame upon the new technologies and social media, digital media for the phenomena of misinformation and disinformation today. It is crucial that we actually consider the role of mainline and mainstream media, especially the most influential ones. And at the most fundamental level, as we all know, they have been implicated, sorry to say, in the profound polarities in our society, and I would say societies around the world. On the one hand, they have been impacted by the polarization of society, but on the other hand, and this is the concerning element, they have been a source of and a propeller of polarization. But more specifically for the subject of our discussion today, I would refer our attention to three trends in particular, and none of them is actually new to any one of us or the audience out there. But it's important to actually point them out. First, the commercialization of media today. Basically, media has become a big business, a massive profit-making machine. Broadly speaking, and again, this is a generalization in order to make a point, there are always exceptions, it's no longer, media is no longer really a mechanism for the promotion of the public good in seeking and reporting on the truth. Because these days, media is about the prerogatives of and interests of capital and the capitalists, the investors. It's about number of clicks. It's about exposure. It's about visibility and prestige. And so the consequences have been manifold and tremendous. One of them, obviously, is that media has actually organized itself in ways that will advance the interests of the profit-making imperative, rather than discovering and driving and disseminating truth. I mean, I lament the fact that we read of reports of mainstream media having basically reduced radically the numbers of solid investigative reporters whose task is to be out there and really looking for the truth, discovering it and reporting it. Rather, they have multiplicity of interns that do surface level research, and that goes on their platform. So first, commercialization. Media is about profit making. Second, and related to the first, obviously, politicization of the media. Much of the mainstream media have become really instruments of the political platforms and political agendas.
Right.
And in that sense, what they produce and give us, the public audiences, is not really journalism or truthful journalism, but rather biased propaganda and oftentimes political propaganda. And that's profoundly dangerous. There is no democratic society that can actually flourish and progress without an independent, impartial, apolitical media that seeks, discovers, and disseminates the truth. And thirdly, and related to the first two, and really in many ways an outcome of the commercialization and politicization of media, is the what I call homogenization of media. What it means is that there is a lot of groupthink. There's a lot of repetition of one another. I mean, you read a story on one platform, you're bound to see the identical story on 5 other platforms.
Right.
This is partly a consequence of this first point of commercialization that I spoke of. They don't invest in what is ultimately much more expensive and costly, deep, substantive, investigative research, but surface level stuff, and oftentimes amounting to repeating each other's material, oftentimes without actually doing even the necessary due diligence and confirmation and affirmation of the veracity of the information that is being published. And this is a cause of a major concern that leads to groupthink. And in many ways, one could say that the mainstream media have really categorized themselves into fronts, basically informed by the political, philosophical orientations of the main parties. And therefore, we receive two sources or info from two sources. Over to you.
So that what I'm hearing from you is that the mainstream media is both impacted by and contributing to the polarization of our society. It's become more commercial, it's more politicized, and it's more homogeneous than it was in the past. And I think I heard recently that if you, as a comparison, were to take the media landscape in the United States in the 1980s, there were over 20 independent companies operating media outlets. Now there are 6. So you can see that sort of reflected in what you're saying. Diana, I'd like to come to you. You're over at UN Women, and we're hearing from Paul about how the media and the mainstream media has become polarized, and it is contributing to the spread of disinformation because it's not necessarily doing a good job of fact-checking and presenting independent and verifiable facts. How is this impacting women and girls around the world?
Thank you, Richard, for having us here and for the question. Well, as we noticed in previous pandemic situation, women were, are, and will be until the end disproportionately affected by the crisis, but also by the disinformation. I have to say that in order to understand the impact, we need to understand the causes. And obviously, I will not speak about cultural biases and about, all the problems that we have, because we also need to look at this from global, regional, and country level perspective. In US, we have one situation. In Moldova, or in Uruguay, or in Kenya, Rwanda, it's a different situation. So one problem that we encountered, and we saw a lot of disparities, is the access. And access to information depends on access to broadband connectivity. We forget that we still have an important part of the world that don't have access to nothing else except radio. And for those women and girls that don't have access to direct information, they hear the information from the word of mouth, or how it's been presented in the source of the media. So out of this cause, we can have such impact as decision on health and body, and they don't have power and agency to take a decision which is correct, which is based on critical thinking, which is based also on the facts, and also on multiple opinions that are given and presented, and for women to have a choice to choose the option that they want. This is one. In the situation when they have access, it's not only important to have connectivity, but it's also important to have the skills and the ability to read. So it comes all together. This is why in the situation that we are now and we observed in the last 2 years, one important impact is violence against women. And it happened in that household, but also it happened online. We speak about cyber violence, we speak about doxing, we speak about, all the manipulated content. And actually, it's interesting that when we speak about targeting of fake news, it's disproportionately also affecting women than men. And it's interesting to look at the data that you have in the report also, on the fake stories and so on and so forth. And I'm sure then that Jennifer will share with us a little bit more on the data. But I'm sure if we can dig a little bit deeper on these false stories, on 70%, whatever proportion of false stories, targeted to women and men, and then targeted to the different kind of representatives of, around the world, we'll see the difference. Also, maybe what I can say that when we speak about the online violence and cyber bullying, we also need to look at the use by women and girls and different categories, right? We now have an emerging wave of first-time users of internet, which are women that had access, maybe in the prime time. But also, we understand that parental care and the care responsibility is a very important factor that affects women not to be so informed, because obviously they are professionals that need to be connected to the work, they are professionals that has household responsibility, and they are professionals that need to take care of elderly or the children. So the impact is they do not have time. And together, we need to understand better how to look at this, and this is why UN Women is advocating for equal representation in all sectors of the industries, and this is why we call for equal representation, because when you speak about the situation of misinformation, we need to understand the situation and the causes in various sectors and how it affects the age gap and obviously geographically speaking. So these are just two examples, and I'm happy to share more later on during the discussion.
Thank you, Diana. And what I'm hearing from that is that, first of all, access to broadband cuts both ways. So first of all, women are disproportionately lacking in broadband access, but even when they do get it, it can also be used against them in the form of cyber violence, doxing, and other forms of cyberbullying. And that has a double implication for women because they are so often in the decision-making capacity when it comes to parental care and other caregiving and household-related decisions, and lack of access to that kind of critical information impacts their ability to make informed decisions and have agency over their lives and the lives that they're responsible for.
Exactly, and I think we need to put one more important: cost of service. And the different information that you can achieve through the smartphone and feature phones. This is also two important elements that I'm sure we'll speak later on.
And in fact, I want to take that to you, Mariela, because I know you've done a lot of work at looking at the impact of disinformation in low connectivity regions and areas. We're hearing from Diana about low connectivity and access for women in particular. One other thing that I'll just throw in there, we heard at a roundtable we did last week that social media does not represent society. I think men are dramatically overrepresented in social media, I think making up more than 60% of online denizens, and men are 2 to 3 times more likely to be retweeted than are women online, so women's voices are not being amplified. But tell me, Mariel, what are you seeing in low connectivity areas, and how are you seeing this play out, not just regionally or geographically, but also for underrepresented populations?
So I think all of the points that Diana made were very important. In low connectivity areas, what we're finding is that it's not only the spread of misinformation with like the usual social media platforms, but also through WhatsApp, SMS, voice. So we're seeing, for example, and I'm going to put a very specific example of also regimes, given my experience, not only in academia, but my life experience, because I'm Venezuelan. Since the 2000s in Venezuela, there have been shutdowns, and of course the stream media that Paul was mentioning has been taken by only one side of the story. So I even remember 9 years ago when I lived in Venezuela, we don't even knew what was happening outside of our doors. We could hear protests, but then you connected to the TV and everything was perfect. You connected to Twitter and there was some information there, here and there, but not really. You weren't sure if that was, the true story. We have been living this since the 2003. So it has been a long time since we have been doing that. And the government actually created groups that were focused on spreading misinformation. And to your point here of 65% of the misinformation was spread by 12 individuals. 12 individuals can do a lot on Twitter, especially if they're going after, a specific topic, so they can create noise. And I remember even when I was here, my parents didn't even know what was happening in the Capitol, so I had to fact check the information for them. So in low connectivity, it becomes explosive when you don't have the sources to connect to a social media platform to look at all the information that is available. You don't have the stream media to actually check, it's like what's happening, even if it's, for a few like stream, like media, let's say now the 6 that are in the US. but you have maybe one. So I think something that we need to think about is also how to regulate. Most of the information in Venezuela currently is going through WhatsApp. People are getting the information through WhatsApp, not even Twitter, not even Instagram, not even like Facebook, nothing. It's coming from WhatsApp because that's low connectivity. It's usually only text. So when the connectivity goes out and comes back, you receive all the text and all the information. That's even easier to for the misinformation that is happening. And something that we need to consider and think about, how are we really handling also the women, the people that don't have access to this technology, because we usually consider misinformation with the enabling technology in between, but what about those who don't have the means to do that? And out of the last point that I want to make, out of the research that I supported at Columbia University in Cuba, we also found that the information was shared, given that they didn't have connectivity. They have a little more now, but still is very weak. They share information peer-to-peer. So they use Bluetooth through their phone, they connected it, they put it close, and they share information in that way or through USBs. So how can we ensure that even with this kind of low connectivity, we call it offline technologies, at that point, how can we ensure that that's also regulated, and how can we make sure that also, we think about those kind of variables as well. And I have a couple of solutions, but I will wait for further in the discussion to come back to it.
Terrific, and we're looking forward to those. And so what I'm hearing is that, building off of Diana's point, she made the point that access to not just the broadband, but the technology itself, the device makes a difference. And what I'm hearing from you is that what we're seeing in low connectivity areas or in underserved populations is that they're tending towards simpler phones and closed groups, like things like WhatsApp and so forth, which makes it really difficult to verify information because we don't know what they're sharing. And if they're not using WhatsApp, they're using other peer-to-peer or offline methods like Bluetooth to Bluetooth or USB, and we have no way of verifying what they're thinking or doing. Fascinating,
Correct.
fascinating. Well, Gregoire, I want to bring you into this conversation. I know that Philip Morris International does a lot of analysis of information and feedback from its consumers, and that you're seeing some interesting trends in that data of how your consumers are feeling and how they're feeling and how they're being treated in the political environment that Paul mentioned earlier. So, Gregoire, what are you seeing?
Well, thank you, Richard, for having us. What I'm going to talk about is less critical than the situation of women in Africa or in Venezuela, but it still offers an interesting set of data points. So my company is engaged into a massive business transformation. Basically, you have more than 1 billion smokers in the world, and we are trying to get them away from cigarettes and move them into better products that are less harmful, and we are engaged with the FDA and all regulators about that. Now, talking about consumer behavior, and of course we are studying that very closely because it's kind of a journey in which you basically have to convince someone to move away from a product that they know very well, which is cigarette. And they know very well, and everyone knows very well. So in the few data points I'd like to offer are, first of all, the need for awareness, which is particularly when you're talking about things that you're using every day. If you talk about something new, everything that can sort of offers a foundation for that change is welcome. Because the second point is the possibility of confusion is absolutely massive, which is every time you have something that seems to be a doubt about something new, you revert back to what you know. And for me, the perfect example of that is in the US, it's the so-called E-Valley crisis. Because it took a little while before the CDC stepped in and said, well, the vaping pandemic, well, it's actually due to the fact that some people were putting illicit additive in the reservoir of their e-cigarette. And that was the cause of the damage. But during that time, and using WhatsApp, and I would say the modern word of mouth, people went back to cigarettes because they thought, oh, that's safer. So I think this is where, in my industry, misinformation is kind of a big issue. If you want to go into the kind of transformation that my company is very seriously engaged into, we're doing 30% of our income today on novel products. And the idea really is to exit the cigarettes business as soon as we can when the conditions are right. So it's a really critical issue. And there I got to articulate it. It's for governments to put clarity in this kind of debate. And the data is extremely interesting to see because it really depends on how governments have done on COVID-19. We can see a clear difference between, a clear correlation, if you wish, country by country between, well, I think my government has done a good job on COVID-19, and yes, I'm ready to listen to new scientific information. When the COVID-19 job has not been very well, then you stick to what you know. And I think this is highlighting also the link between misinformation, but the actual performance of governments in what is possibly the biggest health crisis we had.
So as we're trying to influence people's behavior and get them to move from something that's harmful to something that's less harmful, we have to understand how they're consuming that information, how they're sharing that information, and where they're getting that information. And if they're using closed groups, as Mariela mentioned, it's harder for us to verify whether or not that information is accurate. And we need governments to step in with accurate information. But at the same time, that also, the credibility of that information is correlated to how well they've done in the pandemic.
Quickly, because then you revert to what you know.
Right. Otherwise, they go back to doing the more harmful thing. Fascinating and very interesting. Thank you, Gregoire. Now, I'd like to bring Kai, your thoughts into this conversation, because you've done a lot of work at looking at innovation and collective action on climate. And a lot of that has to do with changing behaviors and getting people to adopt new technologies, as Gregoire has referenced here. But how does misinformation undermine our efforts at this kind of innovation, behavior change, and collective action?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I'm here representing the Foundation for Climate Restoration. You know, it's amazing, because clearly climate has emerged as the topic of the day. But there's so much more that we need to do and change. Mitigation and adaptation are certainly two terms that we all know now worldwide as things to do. But Gregoire used the word transformation that is so critical. In order to get to net zero, mitigation and adaptation simply aren't enough. If we get to zero emissions tomorrow, there's still, you know, over close to 400 parts per million of excess carbon in the atmosphere that we need to deal with. The Foundation for Climate Restoration aims to advocate for that, push for actions, and there's technologies out there, natural solutions, et cetera, that can get us there. The biggest challenge is again, as Gregoire said, on the business side, from our advocacy perspective, is getting people to understand that opportunity. The Paris Climate Accords for Better really got private sector, governments to rally around a framework by which we should act and achieve a goal by 2050. The problem is it doesn't, the issue is that it hasn't embraced new technologies, new opportunities. Though there is language for carbon removal in the Paris Climate Accords, it's not at the level of mitigation adaptation. And our perspective, it should be mitigation, adaptation, what we call restoration, but really removal of legacy carbon. One of the issues that we're facing is in skepticism of sort of new technologies and nomenclature of those technologies. There's a lot of climate groups out there that are conflating direct air capture, a phrase that actually pulls legacy carbon out of the atmosphere, with carbon capture at source, which would limit the carbon from getting out into the atmosphere, but doesn't pull the legacy carbon out. And many groups suggest that gives fossil fuel industries a license to operate as usual. Right? So it's a conflation of terms. As you can see, they're two very different topics. So, you know, the challenge is penetrating that behavior and doing it quickly so that we don't lose this opportunity and we just go back to mitigation adaptation. So it's so interesting that I would have never thought that our perspective as an advocacy organization meshes with the private sector so squarely, but it's true. And I find it quite interesting in the age of COVID that the scientists are still seen as the most trusted segment of the folks who polled, because as we've known during COVID, science has changed, research has changed, it's changed the way in which we behave, the vaccines have come. but the reception to these changes haven't been so embraced, right? And I think it's, again, very similar to technologies that are out there on carbon removal, that there's been some skepticism, as I mentioned, the fossil fuel industries, and immediately being skeptical of, well, who's benefiting from this, rather than thinking of the societal benefits or understanding that technology and the science has evolved and enabled us to move forward.
Right. So we have skepticism that's perhaps on some level natural when new technologies are introduced, but we have a problem with what I might call scientific communication and the easy way in which terms can get conflated and confused in our minds. And I think that's one of the things that is pointed out in the report, is that it's really hard once an idea is lodged or mentioned to unlodge it from your brain, even if it's an untrue thing or you've misconstrued them. So, and I'm sorry also if I didn't correctly get your organization correct. You are with the Foundation for Climate Restoration, so thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
For being.
Look forward to talking about recommendations, because there's some ideas and thoughts that I'm sure my colleague across the table would agree with.
Well, we're going to get into that in just a second, but I want to lastly bring in Jennifer Oldfield. I know what we've heard here in the last few minutes is a conversation about scientific and database communication at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. That is a lot of what you do, and you're also in charge of communications there. So tell us a little bit about, like, what are you seeing the trends in terms of communicating with data? And I know you guys just released a new report in Nigeria. We'd love to hear on Nigeria, we'd love to hear what you're seeing.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having us. I think the points that everyone's made today have been so fascinating, and I'm sort of like throwing away my notes as I speak and kind of bringing in some new stuff. But I think just at a kind of top line, I think what I'm hearing here is a lot of commonality about sort of bias, bias in the media and bias in the way we see technology. And that's something that we at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data sort of deal with a lot. I think you have broadly two camps, the sort of data evangelists, your sort of Davos types, like everything's great and tech will save the world. And then you have your sort of data pessimists, like everything is terrible, we're going to hell in a handcart. And then, as usual, the truth is somewhere in between. So at the Global Partnership, we're engaging in a policy advocacy consultation at the moment. We're calling it the Data Values Project. It's when I look to kind of what Kai is saying about climate, it's funny because we're slightly envious of the climate community, the health community, the gender community, because they have an established position and a kind of sophisticated messaging. The problem with data is that it's neither good nor bad. It's all in the hands of whoever uses it, and so that makes it altogether a more difficult proposition. So we know that we're all guided by the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there's a lot of kind of wiggle room in how do we get there, and sort of context is key. So, what's culturally appropriate in one country may not be in another country. And of course, COVID has really, really brought that out, as many of the speakers have alluded to. So the Data Values Project will aim to kind of clarify some global norms between our 300 partners about what can we all get behind. And I think a lot of it will kind of be along similar lines of the recommendations in this report about, fact production, distribution of ecosystems, neutrality, inclusion, what are the values that we really need to drive, and how can we push that from a sort of legislative and regulatory perspective, because we're trailing behind, and unless we catch up and help our governments catch up, we can't expect private sector to kind of carry all the water when it comes to sort of doing the right thing. You wouldn't expect that in any other industry. Why would you expect it in facts and sort of the information industry? So just to kind of touch on Nigeria, we've been doing with the UN Economic Commission for Africa a project about supporting data production in Africa in 22 different countries. But the example that sort of jumped out was Nigeria, where, they have a particular problem, I'd say, with sort of disinformation and, that exacerbating sort of polarities. I think that if there's a vacuum of information, then misinformation and disinformation will fill it. And so a lot of what we do is about kind of getting everyone on the same page and making sure that people see the same facts. So in this example, we work with the Presidential Task Force, we work with the Statistics Office and, the Health Ministry to make sure that the data was available, that it was timely, that it was available, that it was tailored to different regions. And, you know, we brokered partnerships with Esri and with Grid3, who are a conglomerate of different sort of geospatial experts, to make sure that that information was there, it was trusted, and that all of the different entities were pointing to one place. I'm terribly sorry. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I wish we all had timers like that. So that's fantastic. So what I'm hearing from you is that data and technology are neither good nor bad. They're tools, and context makes a huge difference. And we need to have global norms, but global norms that are tailored to our individual contexts, and that when there is a lack of information, we have to recognize that that vacuum will get filled, and it's going to get filled oftentimes with misinformation and disinformation.
Exactly.
So thank you, Jennifer. I want to now bring up our recommendations. If we could bring up our presentation on the recommendations for a moment. I want to run through those really quickly with us, and then really dive into that next part of the conversation around what you guys here in the room are thinking on our different recommendations. And for those of you at home, you've seen several of us reference our report. It is available online, and there's a very handy infographic with some fast facts that you might want to take a look at. While you're bringing up the recommendations, I'll just go ahead and dive into them. What we've got here are, as I mentioned, 5 recommendations that we've looked at across public sector, civil society, and the private sector. And the first recommendation that we have is that we need to build an autonomic response through awareness and nudging. And what we mean by that is that a lot of people talk about media literacy, but we don't necessarily need people to become experts in digital or media literacy. We need them to be aware and understand what's happening, but they don't necessarily need to be experts. And the analogy that I use is that of physical education in schools. My kids, I have 3 of them, they go to PE class and they go to health class every semester, but they don't need to become experts in rope climbing or volleyball or in nutrition. What they do need is to get a deep sense of what it means to have a physical and active lifestyle and to have a healthy lifestyle, have a little bit more green on the plate, go out for a run once in a while. And we need that same kind of level of media literacy brought into everybody's lives. But we also need to build nudges and decision architecture into the platforms so that we don't have to rely on people actually making active decisions all of the time. The other classic example that I use here is that my wife is a classic decision architect on health. The candy is hidden and away. The fruits and vegetables are an easy reach. So we want to make it easy to access the facts, harder to find the disinformation. The second recommendation that we have is that we want the good guys to have the same or better tools and that would allow them to combat disinformation with the same speed and agility as the bad guys are producing it. And one of the things that you'll see in the report is that we distinguish between the bad guys, people who are actively producing disinformation, and those of us who are passive consumers, which is the vast majority of us, and what we might call unwitting accomplices. And those are people who, with all good intention, are passing along disinformation, not because they are intending to do harm, but in many cases because they're actually trying to help their friends and family. So they come across pieces of disinformation, they don't know that it's disinformation, and they pass it along. There are good guys out there who are actively trying to combat disinformation. We need to make sure that they have the same kinds of tools and technologies that the bad guys have. The third trend is that we need to update the limits of the distribution of free speech. We all are entitled to our opinions, but we have never been entitled to the free distribution of those opinions. That is a relatively new advent of technology and platforms of our modern day. We need to instead update our legal and regulatory frameworks and the business models that the tech companies rely on to make sure that we are creating the ability to independently verify and monitor what is actually being spread on those platforms and to not give a free pass to disinformation. The fourth trend that we have is that we need to invest in longitudinal studies on policy effectiveness. Jennifer just alluded to the idea of creating new global norms. What we expect, and is what is highlighted in the report, is that different regimes, different legal systems around the world will take different approaches. The United States will take a different approach than the European Union, than will states across Africa or in Latin America. And that, to some degree, is okay. We need to let them go ahead and do that, A, because we can't stop them, and B, because it actually sets up some natural experiments where we can see and evaluate whether or not these different policy approaches work. And lastly, we are suggesting that we need to focus on the fact production and distribution ecosystem. And what we mean by this is that it is hard to impossible to debunk misinformation once it is lodged in your brain. And in fact, many efforts to do that just lodge it further in the brain. And one of the things that we learned in our consultative research is that particularly for older folks, the more we repeat the lie, the more it gets embedded in their brain, even if we are telling them that it's a lie. So we need to make sure that we don't, rather than trying to debunk, we need to pre-bunk information, do a better job at getting the facts out there in the first place. And then when we do have to do fact-checking or debunking, we do that in very specific ways that don't exacerbate the problem. So those are the 5 recommendations in the report. I now want to bring back in our panelists if we could. And Paul, I want to come first to you again because what we just heard from Jennifer and from Kai and from Gregoire was about the complexity of communicating scientific information. And you're there at the New York Academy of Science, and I know you've done a lot of work at looking at how storytelling and narrative approaches can impact individual trust in science. So how can we be better at this?
Right. Thank you so much. Look, we learned at least 20 years ago from the marketing gurus, be it at Harvard Business School or any other of the leading business schools of the world, that to really move opinion and ultimately decision and choice of be it customers or clients, statistics and numbers and data are not sufficient. You need a story. You need to humanize the information. And for the ability to actually impact hearts and minds and move large masses of people and significant decision making, especially in the cases such as has been under the conditions of this universal pandemic, to be successful in large-scale public health campaigns, storytelling, and a narrative approach to disseminating information and trying to educate populations is absolutely decisive. So instead of just or primarily telling the audiences out there through whichever platform or media, traditional or the more recent digital and social media, just speaking about the laboratory data that provides validity about the efficaciousness of a vaccine and on is insufficient. But telling a story of a life that has been saved is absolutely perhaps equally powerful, if not more powerful. So I have been actually working with a number over the last year plus, a number of entities, including the CDC, by the way, here in the US, and pharmaceutical companies, as well as major players like UNICEF and others internationally, about surfacing out, giving visibility to the many millions of stories of individuals and families and communities that have positively been impacted by the whole enterprise of immunization and vaccination, to use again the case of this public health crisis that we're still in the middle of. So to surface out the story of a mother who knows deep down in her heart and mind that her 2 children, be that in Namibia, be that in Vietnam, be that in the global north, are perhaps alive today because of the effective vaccines that they were given in the first perhaps 6 months of their life or the first year or 2 years. Hundreds of millions of lives have been saved over the decades since the invention of the first vaccines because of vaccines. And so that has been my argument, that we need much more of the deployment and the use of the narrative approaches to complement the scientific approaches, the statistical and the data-driven information sharing and dissemination in order to expect greater results.
Can I ask, though, Paul,
yes.
Just a follow-up on that? I've heard this quite a bit, that we should use more narratives and stories to communicate complex information. And I think that's one of the reasons why Americans get made fun of, because we compare everything to football fields. How many people, how big, if we want to communicate a big number, we compare it to football fields, or a large number of people to the number of people in a football stadium. But why aren't more scientists doing it? So, I mean, we had a lot of time to prepare for the pandemic and theoretically to get our communications right for it. But we didn't, and we haven't had really a good success. I haven't seen a lot of scientists who I would point to and say, yeah, that guy uses narrative really well. Why do you think more scientists don't use more narrative?
Well, it may not be entirely fair to expect from the scientists to be great storytellers. They have not been shaped and molded, either through their education or through their practice, to be necessarily storytellers. They're best when it comes to data and statistics and the scientific method and the results, etc. However, complementing their knowledge dissemination by other sources and other experts and other players in the different domains with the narrative approaches. So this complementary approach would be so much more consequential and helpful, I believe.
And so, Gregor, how are you seeing that play out? I mean, you work for a big company, you've got access to lots of data, lots of science. How do you take Paul's point here about using narrative, and how perhaps is PMI using narrative to communicate more scientific information?
Well, I think, first of all, as a company, and our responsibility is different, it's to play by the book. So you put a product on the market, associated with claims, you have to follow the regulatory process behind that, which means time, science, investment in both. For example, it took us about 3 years to get from the FDA a modified risk for the new products that we have in the US. So you play by the book on your products, and you play by the book with what you perceive is the public policy agenda, which in our area is particularly tough, but we, basically the holy trinity of tobacco control is don't start, please try to quit, and then if you cannot do any of this, well, maybe look at better alternatives. That's exactly what we are saying. I think the question for us, and I come back to the consumer, because really we work for them, is what is effective to convey that you have played by the book. And because I'm going to be very straightforward here, but even when we play by the book, we have a feeling it's never really enough. And we wonder where will that be acceptable? And I'd like to raise the question to my colleagues that, is there science, but science that has to be politically acceptable? And that's the question that I think is upon us in the big transformation where we are, which is we are doing exactly everything by the book. But is there something else? Do we have to pass a sort of political control test? And if I have to be very direct again, we think it's a very slippery slope. Science is science. But then, to your point on narrative, I'd prefer not. I'd prefer that we stick to the facts and science and what the institutions say. Maybe that's their job to explain what is behind the science.
Fantastic. So what I'm hearing from you is that the message that the company has is, if you don't smoke, don't start. If you do smoke, quit. If you can't quit, switch to a lower harm product. But you want that to be informed by good information. And I know I read in The Economist last week that The economist said that regulators and politicians are right to worry about the long-term effects of e-cigarettes, but widespread bans risk foregoing the potential health benefits of people turning to e-cigarettes as a substitute for the conventional sort, because e-cigarettes are nowhere near as nasty as their combustible cousins. So, which I think is sort of backing that point there, that if you can't quit, you should switch to something of lower health risk. But how do you think that regulators, because you're posing this point about a political test for science, how do you think that regulators and politicians could do a better job of being fair arbiters of science in the regulatory realm?
Well, first of all, they should take responsibility for the processes that they put in front of companies, which most do, by the way. But then this is where we go back to the narratives. It is going to be much easier if there is a partnership. So if companies play by the book, and I heard some companies in the tech sector don't like to be regulated. We are happy to be regulated, just to make that point. So if you play by the book and you check all the boxes, then you are in a good place to have a bit of a concerted effort with governments to just pass that message in a way that is consistent, that precisely is not creating the state of confusion in the journey for consumers. And this is where we are in a number of places around the world, in the UK, in New Zealand, in some European countries. But obviously you need to have that, because indeed the level of controversy that is inherent to the social media debate today otherwise is making that very, very difficult, and confusion is going to only take consumers back to what they know.
So Kai, I want to bring this to you, because part of what I'm hearing in Gregoire's point is that we also have to become better evaluators of risk and of harm. And I know when you're looking at different approaches to climate, as an example, I read this morning that more people have died last week from coal-related health illnesses than died in all of Fukushima or Chernobyl combined. But yet nuclear power is still considered like off limits and something we don't explore. How do you think, when we're looking at new technologies related to climate, similar to the new technologies that Gregoire is talking about, how do we become better decision makers around risk, and how can perhaps the narrative approaches that Paul is talking about help us with that?
Yeah, a couple things. I think one is that we at the Foundation for Climate Restoration approaches this exact topic with one of hope, as opposed to X number of people lost their lives. And,
right.
So that's
so you're data optimist, like Jennifer was telling us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that still is a very difficult, or a very different angle than the doom and gloom that's out there, right? So in order to win over hearts and minds, besides just being hopeful, I think what Paul said was really critical. I agree that the storytelling and the narrative is part of it. Now, from our perspective, what that storytelling and narrative is providing examples of successful technologies, data behind the amount of carbon that can be removed from the atmosphere, explaining to folks that there's fun consumer goods solutions out there, like a carbon negative vodka that you can purchase, or that there's carbon negative diamonds that can be manufactured that pull legacy carbon from the atmosphere. I think telling stories like that help the everyday activist understand that this is real, and this is a possibility. So rather than saying there's technology, broadly speaking, that can pull legacy carbon out of the atmosphere, providing examples that are relevant to the consumer or the individuals, like all of us in the room, I think matter. And then also for other contexts in the developing world and others, reforestation, seed health farm restoration, regenerative agriculture, other means that can pull carbon from the atmosphere, I think are critical, again, in A, hope, and B, letting more people understand the potential that we have in front of us.
Well, in fact, when I think about the two challenges of say, quitting smoking or ending combustible cigarettes, and I think about the challenge of climate, one of the things that occurs to me is that both of those things feel very overwhelming, and like, I don't know what to do. And so Gregoire gave us a pretty clear rubric: if you don't smoke, don't start; if you do smoke, quit. and if you can't quite switch, what I'm hearing you say is that there are ways besides deprivation that we can help solve the climate crisis. Maybe I can drink my carbon capture vodka or buy carbon capture diamonds. That's not going to get us all the way there, but at least it is something that gives me more hope and gives me clear actions that I can take.
Right, and then I would just add, I think one other action we can all take is policy, right? Pushing for policy. What we hope for is that there's more dialogue around this topic at moments like COP26, across the way at UNGA and others. More universities are taking on this topic and doing more research and analysis on this opportunity. But I do think it's the policy shift. It's not primary. It's not, as I think Jennifer said earlier, it's not going to be solved solely by the private sector. It's going to require, governments to get on board, policies that provide an enabling environment for those entrepreneurs, those scientists to really have an industry and a solution that thrives.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to give, as communicators, we need to use narrative, use anecdotes, but also give people clear decision architecture that they can navigate, and we need to advocate for more effective public policy. Okay, Jennifer, I want to come to you because I want to go back to Paul's original point about the use of narrative, and I'm still left with my question about why aren't more data people doing a better job using narratives? What is the Global Partnership doing anything about this, or what do you see out there that we could do better on this point of communicating scientific data and complex topics?
For sure, thanks for the question. I mean, when Paul was talking, I was reminded of that quote that statistics are just people's lives with the tears washed off, And I think it's, if you've ever tried to get good storytelling out of statisticians, then you know how tough it can be. And the same with scientists. And, as Paul said, it doesn't necessarily have to fall to them, but to the people who work with them. I think going back to what Diana said earlier, I think sort of in thinking about stories, where do they come from? They come from listening. And then I think, where are people, where are they sharing their stories? Then you have to go back to the methods that people are using. So one example that springs to mind of better data storytelling for us is a project on citizen-generated data in Kenya. And the problem that we're really trying to solve with the Wellcome Foundation and with Africa's Voices Foundation is sort of misuse of antibiotics and the antimicrobial resistance problems that stem from that. That's an issue, obviously, all over the world, but it's very culturally dependent. And so, the way people act, the way they get hold of the antibiotics and the different ways that they might abuse them or the different misinformation they might hear is sort of culturally dependent. So in this case, we went into 3 counties in Kenya and we brought in some health experts and we participated in sort of radio Q&As and had people call in, and then we had community engagement dialogues. And we heard a really amazing story from a woman called Mako Fania, who's based in Kiambu County. And she was telling this really sad story, which, she was happy to share because at the end of this process, she really wanted others to kind of hear. And the story was just that, she had a child who had failure to thrive. Thankfully, he's fine now, but she would begin to give him antibiotics that were sort of donated to her by neighbors. And then as soon as he seemed to be better, she would discontinue the antibiotics and be like, okay, great, he's fine. But of course, it had a horrible cycle of like him getting sicker, then her doing the same again. So through this process of engagement via radio stations and community engagement, she sort of learned that you really have to finish the course. You can't just use antibiotics when the problem may be viral, and you can't accept drugs from neighbors. So, this is an example that we sort of captured, and then we'll, share more widely and use that advocacy. But I think kind of using that context and sort of reporting that out to other people who may be in the same situation is part of what's needed to tell sort of powerful stories that will really resonate and get traction with other people who may be in the same situation.
Gosh, what I love about that is, what I'm hearing in there is that in some cases, in particular that example you just gave, the story gathering is in itself the storytelling, because you were actually going through this really engaging process to gather the stories and also retell them, and that where do good stories come from? They come from good listening and being able to do that, and that the media is the message. So you pick a context-appropriate medium, in that case radio, to both gather and tell the story.
Exactly.
Wow, that's fantastic. Mariel, I want to take it to you because, and Jennifer, perhaps I'll also keep you in the conversation, because I'm very concerned about how this is playing out in the global South and in authoritarian regimes. You know, you referenced Venezuela, but one of the things we talked about in the report is the need for tech-enabled nudges. We talked about the difficulty, though, of low technology access amongst different regions and populations, and low connectivity in some countries. I'd love to hear your reflections on what Jennifer just said and how you see that playing out in the global South, and what in particular we might do in authoritarian regimes or low connectivity areas.
Thank you, Richard. And following up what Jennifer just mentioned, and also going on Kai and Gregoire, we have the mistrust of government, and if we're waiting for standards to be deployed all over the world, we're also trusting that these governments are not regimes. So like a big point that I want to make, not only as a Venezuelan, but now wearing my Engineering for Change hat, is how much we need to lean on civic society, nonprofits, and organizations that are vetting the information from a very technical and unbiased perspective. At Engineering for Change, we actually have a very close approach to what Kai was mentioning and Gregoire, in the sense that we were created by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and IEEE, so electronic and electric engineers, and they are the ones that create the standards for this engineering field. At Engineering for Change, we focus on the new technologies that are trying to solve issues or challenges in the world that are kind of new. That includes climate change, but also includes off-grid energy or like misinformation in low connectivity settings. And we're trying to create kind of a network of experts. At Engineering for Change, we have more than 1,000 experts that are vetting the information, connected to more than 200 universities all over the world. So I think this mix of nonprofit with academia, it's key in order to combat information, because it's coming from frameworks and sources that could be trusted. And I think if this is replicated in many areas, including the tobacco industry or climate change, this is something that it's needed. To your point, that this kind of distribution channels need to be enabled in this social media platform, so that they get a voice that is respected, so that we can actually get the information out there. For us, the most important thing is unbiased information that has an engineering perspective, that we know performance, so that we're not having this like kind of website with one technology. We have, for example, the water pump. It's a solution that we usually highlight, where there was 50 million invested in a solution that was unfeasible from a technology perspective. It was a water pump that was deployed all over Africa. 50 million, including USAID, JC, invested in this technology, and 50 million went to waste. So if you have kind of these bodies of knowledge that are vetting that information, we can create kind of, or combat the misinformation, at least of these new technologies that need to be out there to solve important challenges.
So we need to have unbiased information from trusted sources that also understand the context in which they're operating. Is that right? And I know one of the things that we heard in our consultative research was that, coming back to you, Jennifer, on some of the research that you've done in Africa, what we found when we were talking to our colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa was that because the media industry has been so hollowed out there, referencing back to what Paul was talking about at the beginning, they're oftentimes taking information from the global north, even information that is about their own country. They're waiting for the feed from BBC or from the Associated Press, and not able to really produce local information that would actually be trusted. What are you seeing from the global partnership perspective on how we can create more effective fact production systems in those countries in the first place?
Thanks so much for the question. I mean, I'm sort of struck when we're talking about COVID and the kind of global lack of immunity, that there's a lot of parallels with sort of this information, disinformation system where if you don't have the capacity, if you don't have that kind of awareness, then you're very vulnerable. And of course, you know, global South countries who their statistical systems haven't been invested in, or, you know, they don't have the kind of state building, or there just needs to be generally more money pumped into strengthening those systems, because otherwise they're vulnerable to the kind of disinformation and, you know, the sort of digital colonialism and data colonialism that does come from, you know, importing technologies from the West, but they're importing the ills of those societies as well as the virtues of those societies. So, you know, frankly, it does come down to money, capacity building, pipelines, you know, investing in the university system, and that comes in just, you know, in the capability of things like data analysts, people, you know, with machine learning capabilities, but also media, storytelling, communications, and, you know, frankly, just critical thinking. And that's a problem in the global South, but increasingly it's a problem in the global North as well, you know, where how can you teach the kind of sophisticated response that you need to sort of run that information through your kind of skeptical filter. I was reading a few articles earlier, and it was saying, you know, that older people are particularly susceptible to disinformation because they don't have that kind of fluency, that literacy that helps them sort of decide between, you know, what's really behind the power. And so I think we can strengthen all of those systems. We know how to do it. It's just a case of getting states to value it, and also, you know, as I mentioned before, kind of deciding what are our red lines. You know, we're talking about bad actors and malign states. It's very difficult to say who's crossed the line if we don't have more consensus on what's appropriate and what isn't.
You know, one of the things we heard from we had a peer advisory board that oversaw the research, and one of the things from the psychologists and sociologists on the board, to your point about older folks, is that it's not just that they don't have the digital literacy, memory, which is a very unreliable source for any of us to begin with, but particularly as you get older, your memory starts to fade, and so they'll hear a fact, or which might be a true fact or an untrue fact, but they don't remember if it was true or not true.
So fascinating.
And so just the fact that they heard it can impact them. But so I want to take this question now to you, Diana, because what we've heard from Gregoire and from Mariela and from Jennifer is the need for norms and for standards. And I'd love to hear your thoughts from UN Women. What do you think is the role of multilateral institutions in helping us get our handle? And one of the recommendations in the report is around letting some experimentation in public policy, but where do you see the role of multilaterals?
Well, I think we need to highlight the power of partnerships here. And in doing so, UN agencies are collaborating as one UN. And we saw earlier in the year, UN Secretary General calling for an active campaign against disinformation, right? For those who are following the UN social media and UN agencies' social media, you will see that we all in our respective agencies, focusing on our respective stakeholders, we're trying our best to represent cases, coming with storytelling, but also with data. For example, UN Women has an initiative, Women Count, and right from the beginning of the pandemic, we took the rapid gender assessments and to understand globally where we do have representation in the country offices, what are the situation, what do we need, not only to be in the moment, but to preempt certain situation. And I see one of the conclusion of the report is that in this recent environment, and people in the community were also a very high-level source. So we need to work in partnership with the community that we have. And who are our community? Well, employees, It's, it's everybody in the community. For us, a community represents, globally women and girls around the world. But for example, what we advocate is to pay attention, and we invite corporates to sign and implement the women empowerment principles, which are the set of 7 principles that guide corporate world on how to implement the policies in the marketplace, workplace, and community. And community is, employees, and it comes from the disinformation, how they can reach information, and also. Going back to the data a little bit, is we saw scientists 73%, but it's so important to understand the scientific aspects for different stakeholders. For example, we know that around the world, women researchers are represented less than 30%, according to UNESCO data. So guess what type of articles women are reading around the world about, COVID, about effects, is the general one. But for example, if I am, 18 or 20 young women in whatever country in the world, what this will be the effects on the reproductive health? What this will be the effects on so on and so forth? We need to pay attention to this dimension. And this is why the equal representation in all the professions is important. And this comes to partnership, because this, for example, another example is working with men and boys around the world, and we do so via he for she movement. Also, this comes to partnership working with advertising and marketing agencies, and we are doing so via stereotype alliances. So making sure that whenever we talk with our consumers, right, we do give the purpose of consumption, but also the social aspect of it. So all of this is partnership in various forms, in various aspects at the regional level and again global level. And for example, it can be also such a partnership as Equal Global Partnership. And I wanted to mention that this is a partnership between UN Women, ITC, ITU, GSMA, and UN University. We work with institutions around the world, civil society, both the private sector, basically to deliver trainings. And in one of its bigger framework of partnership is another example, generation equality. We recently celebrated 25 years from Beijing Declaration, right? And under the generation equality commitments, specifically Action Coalition on Innovation and Technology, global companies in tech industry such as Google, TikTok, Twitter, I think, and sorry if I forgot anyone else, joined a commitment to be more careful in delivering also the training on cyber violence, again, partnership. So one UN at the UN level, but also partnership at the local and community level. So we make sure that various stakeholders are informed in equal manner. And if we talk about the policy at the broadband level, I just want to mention that we really advocate for digital inclusion in broadband. Not only the plan, but also digital economy, and also with a specialized focus on marginalized and vulnerable communities, and such as women and girls. So this is something that we're working with the partners and ministries of telecommunication, and hopefully all of us, the efforts that we mentioned today, and we know that many other stakeholders are working at the local and global level, will bring a new change, and it will not be only an opportunity where we see the devastating, impact of a pandemic, but will be an aha moment of all of us to be better, to be stronger, and to, I know that we are used to say, bring back better or so. I don't want to back to normal. I want to gender equal, to a more feminized, to a more strong in science, to a more with information. I want another better. And more improved better, and hopefully a partnership between private, public, and UN multilateralism will help in doing so.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we don't want to just Build Back Better shouldn't mean going back to how things were. It means we want to, across all the professions, but also specifically in research, so that we can really see the impacts of crises as they affect women and girls and all people, and kind of clear up those perceptions. And that partnerships across public, private, and civil society can really help us to get there.
Exactly.
Excellent. So what I've heard so far is, Paul, I've heard from you the importance of narrative and the use that scientists can make use of narrative to better communicate clearly and to make it very clear and clarify complex topics by using good stories. We heard from Gregoire the importance of a good decision architecture and the role that governments can play in being a fair arbiter of that information. We heard from Kai the importance of actually actionable recommendations that aren't just doom and gloom, but also give us hope and let us see what we can do as individuals. Jennifer, we heard from you about the importance of listening as storytelling. The gathering of the story becomes the telling of the story, and the use of effective mediums and engaging process to get that information out into the world. Mariela, we heard from you the importance of having unbiased information coming from trusted sources. And Diana, of course, we just heard about partnerships. What did I miss? Is that pretty good?
That was
Excellent.
So in our last few minutes, we've got about 10 minutes remaining. What I want to do is do one lightning round with everybody. I'd like to hear from you one thing you think that people who are listening in right now could go and do to help combat disinformation and misinformation in science in particular. Is Paul still with us? Did we lose Paul? Okay, we've lost Paul. That's unfortunate. But Paul, we'll look forward to hearing from you later. But Kai, if I can maybe start with you, what is one thing you would recommend to people listening in today, what that they can go and do to help combat disinformation?
I think if I would make a plug for the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which would be pushing out stories and information related to carbon removal and the opportunities to get involved. But really, I think it's what Mariela mentioned is that civil society, I think the message coming out of civil society, following those channels as that unbiased vessel of storytelling and narratives is one action to take as it pertains to misinformation.
So seek out trusted sources in civil society that you can follow and help to spread their stories.
Exactly right.
And in fact, one thing I wanted to also point out, and Diana mentioned it in the infographic that we have, it did say that scientists are trusted by 73% of people. That's followed closely by people in the community, 62%. And I think one of the things we heard, we often think in the United States and in the Western world about so-called social media influencers. One of the things we heard in the report is actually that one of the most effective influencers are people with followings of 500 or less. That if you're trying to get information out into a community, that's a person that you might actually know personally versus like Beyonce, who is so far removed from us. So I love that. So find trusted sources, follow them, and help spread their ideas. Jennifer?
I think it really has to be meet people where they are, translate into the languages that they speak in, democratize the technologies and the data so that they can use it. Because if you come towards people, then they'll amaze you with what they can do if you put technology and data in their hands and communicate with them on their own terms. Then really the answers will reveal themselves.
So meet people where they are and help them find the information with you. Go on the journey with them. Yeah. I love that. Thank you. Mariela?
I will also, from what Kai mentioned, but also following my own experience from Venezuela, what we did was actually create stronger civil society, find sources of information that were aligned to our, like what you were saying, local community, empower them, follow them, spread the knowledge that they're sharing. For us, for example, we have WhatsApp groups that we know are fact-checking what's happening, so we know who to follow. Of course, that takes time. We also have mailing lists, that are spreading the information, that is right. So kind of following, that trend of enabling, empowering local sources of information, empowering civil society, following platforms like Engineering for Change, of course, I had to say that, that can enable, and you can start following and hearing this information. So hopefully we become more powerful than the bad guys.
So take responsibility for your own information consumption. And if you are on a closed platform like WhatsApp, you can access services that will help you to double check and fact check.
Yeah.
So subscribe to those. Terrific. Thank you. Gregoire, your thoughts.
I'm facing consumers, so I think I would turn to them and say, am I consuming responsibly? And that doesn't only apply to our products, but to, mobility and carbon footprint and the way you use social media. But it's very prevalent in the way we interact with them. As mentioned, we try to make them consider the journey to change really profoundly their lifestyle as long as they have the right information. And that would be really also, where do I have the right information? Do I think I do? And where is the limit of my freedom? Because that's also something which, in the industry, this industry and beyond, at some point it's also about if people are sufficiently informed, they're adults, and they take decisions for themselves.
So be an informed consumer and a conscientious consumer, both of information generally and of media generally, but specifically about your products and services.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult debate we're having because in a way we're also talking about nanny state, not nanny state. And I think really we can reduce the volume on that and say it's about information. Are you sufficiently informed? Is the information coming from reliable sources? Are you an adult? And then you make your own decisions because that's a democracy.
And make your own decisions in a democracy. Thank you, Gregoire. Diana, last word to you.
Well, first of all, for those who are interested in the subject of women and girls around the world, I kindly invite you to consult our reports that we other organization worked in the last 2 years, or specifically 1.5 years. We worked hard to kind of analyze regionally and globally and to provide some data and correct information. So you need to be an informed citizen. And, I do believe that our extraordinary abilities coming from the ordinary, our ordinary extraordinary. So in order to be so, just choose your path, your segment, and one page at a time to be informed. This is one. And I also believe that we need to talk frankly about promises practices, or so-called good examples, but also about challenges. I think we don't talk too much about challenges, and this will help us to reinvent the wheel. If we talk about the challenges in this industry, in another industry, we can see what are the, repeating trends or problems about disinformation, and to learn from those and to make sure that we move faster than we are today.
So stay on top of information that's relevant to you and consume it in bite sizes as you can, and then be aware of the challenges facing your industry or other industries, and look at how disinformation is impacting and learn from others so that we can adopt better practices from other industries.
Yeah, adaptation is a very good word now, yes.
So learn from each other and adapt lessons from other industries. Fantastic. Well, there you have it, folks. You've heard from our illustrious panel. Hopefully you have also had a chance to download and read our report. We are very excited and so grateful to our sponsors from Philip Morris International and to our host here at Japan Society. And we're so grateful for all of you joining us here from around the world. We've really enjoyed the conversation here in the room. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation online. If you haven't gotten the report, you can get it at CollaborateUp.com. We hope that you will download it and contribute to the ongoing dialogue on the importance of combating disinformation, particularly when it comes to science. And for those of you who are here in New York, we hope that you enjoy the rest of UN General Assembly Week and the weeks to come. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you to Diana, to Kai, to Jennifer, to Mariela, and to Gregoire. Give them all a big hand, if you would, please.
And to Richard.
Thank you, Richard.